Alright, Diablo 4 players, let's go over it. The best weapons in the game. What are the roles that people really want that you're going to be able to either use yourself, or if you want to engage in trade, sell these for billions and billions of gold. So for starters, one of the most important things that people don't consider is the base of the weapon. Just like in other action RPGs like Path of Exile, there's what's called an implicit on the item, and that will never actually change. You cannot reroll this and change it into something else. So these happen when you actually look at the exact item type. So for example, on a one-hander, if you get an axe, it will always have a implicit of damage over time. If you get a sword, it will always roll with critical strike damage. If you get a legendary mace, it always rolls with overpower. That is an important thing to consider when you are equipping this on your character as a character. Even if you get multiple greater affixes on, let's say, a mace, if you have no overpower, that implicit is basically useless. But overall, the stats that people want most of the time, like if you're looking for specifically like what are the greater affixes that have the most value in the game. Now it may be dependent on the build, but most of the time it comes down to the main stat of the character, meaning that if you're playing Barbarian, it's going to be strength. If you're playing the Necromancer or the Sorceress, it will be intelligence. So that is one of the most important things on one of the weapons, as well as getting maximum life and then some sort of damage. Now if you're playing, let's say, a damage over time build, some of these rolls will roll higher with, let's say, overpower or damage over time, and it may depend on the build that you're playing to really min-max the numbers here, because some of these numbers actually did get changed, but on average most of the times it's going to be vulnerable damage. And the reason why is most people will have 100% chance to deal vulnerable like application on the enemy. So that is more so the highest uptime. Sometimes with crit damage, it used to roll higher in certain areas in terms of like rolls, but since they kind of like stat squished a lot of the things, they have actually reduced the numbers on a lot of just things in general. And also the implicits have changed, so I wanted to make an updated video for specifically Season 9 and beyond. So let's go ahead and go over it with all the classes, but even if I'm not covering the class, sometimes there is overlap because there was an update where it allowed other character classes to like run swords and as well as maces. They kind of lowered the restrictions on a lot of the characters, so even if again I'm covering, let's say, the Barbarian, some of this will go over to other classes as well. So for starters, as far as the two-hander on the Barb, it's pretty much just going to be the mace because there is literally no other option. But again, in every single stat, it depends on the build, but I'm just going to say this kind of for 99% of the player bases and builds, it's going to be main stat, vulnerable damage, maximum life. That's going to be the big money makers, the billions and billions. So we won't have to go over that. Now we're going to mainly focus in on the weapon archetypes, again, for that implicit now. So as far as one-handed, again, this goes across all characters because you can pretty much run all of the one-handers unless it's like a unique item for that class for the rest of the characters. So how it works is you're really looking for that implicit, and also what you can also look at is the attacks per second in the one-handed category. In this one in particular, they're all going to have the same attacks per second. This can matter for certain animations and breakpoints, but I won't go super nerdy in this part of the video. I'm just going to tell you which ones are just better here. But they actually all have the same on the one-hander. It's 1.1. And as far as it goes, the damage over time, the critical strike damage, it depends on your build. However, the ones that usually hold the most value in the one-handed category are mainly going to be swords. The one exception is if you are playing a damage over time build, then you can no longer benefit off of that critical strike damage in most cases. There are some builds that can do crit in damage over time builds, but then you would want an axe if you're doing some sort of bleed build or maybe a poison build where you're relying on that damage over time and the crit strike damage does not matter. Now, if you can do overpower, it is a 15% bonus if you can 100% overpower. There's very few builds in this game that will let you have 100% overpower, with the exception of maybe the Spiritborn. The Druid can kind of do it with these poison puddles, but it only works on the puddle themselves. So most of the time, it's still advantageous to run, let's say, a sword in a lot of the builds if you are also doing crit, because usually crit and overpower kind of go hand in hand over here. But again, it depends on the build. If you're playing the Druid, though, you're going to be running the Rotting Lightbringer. So as far as it goes on the one-handers, it depends on the build, but most of the time swords hold the highest value. Now, as far as, let's say, a two-hander over here, again, this is something that where it depends on on the build. However, this is where it gets a little bit different. You can see with specifically the two-handed axe over here, it has 0.9 attacks per second, which is actually a slower attack speed. And a lot of times people don't really want the axe because of that. Again, it has your entire stats getting multiplied or getting a negative multiplier because of that. However, the base damage could be technically higher, but it has a different attack speed breakpoint for a lot of the skills. So you have crit strike damage on swords just like you would before, and a lot of the builds may want specifically a sword for like while you have a sword equipped or while you have a polearm, you can run different things. But for the most part, for Barbarian, the only ones that have really been seeing play is going to be the two-handed sword and the polearm. There's very few variants where it will be running the two-handed axe as far as like the best in slot for the two-hander here. Now, moving on to the Spiritborn, there's pretty much only one option, which is going to be that quarterstaff. So getting damage to elites is not bad, or vulnerable damage like I mentioned before, but in Spiritborn's case over here, as far as like what should you run, most of the time it's going to be a quarterstaff. The block chance over here, what that does, it's a little bit different than some other action RPGs. So instead of block, meaning that you, if you have, let's say, have blocked the attack, you don't take 0 damage, you take damage reduction. And the default, I believe, is 15%, but this can actually be scaled when you get like block damage reduction. But for the most part, this is the best stat in the entire game in terms of like which item is the most important. So if you happen to get like a 3 GA glaive, which some people will try to sell for, billions and billions, which sometimes people buy, but the actual best in slot for the weapon in the Spiritborn category is going to be the quarterstaff, specifically, again, for the block. And there's another bonus here, is it has 1.1 attacks per second. Again, a lot of builds want to go as fast as possible with the attacks per second. Now, as far as the rogue goes, there is some damage over time builds. So if you are running a dot build with, let's say, like the poison twisting blades or something, then you want to run the daggers. The daggers give you damage to close enemies, where the critical strike damage is useless for dot builds because dots should not be able to crit. But like, there's one exception with like the Spiritborn where you actually do stat crit. But for the most part, it's just going to be much more valuable to run daggers, especially for playing a melee build. In the earlier stages before you get 100% crit, all of that is going to be much better. Plus it also has a multiplier of 1.2 for the attacks per second. In general though, those numbers usually try to add up to the same, but attack speed is very important on a lot of breakpoints for the rogue class. But again, it's just that damage to close will be up 100% of the time, whereas crit, unless you have 100%, it's going to be a little bit harder. But if you are playing a ranged build, then obviously damage to close is less valuable. So think about that as well. Basically what it comes down to is swords are just simply going to be more valuable. Now, once again, this is where it gets a little bit different depending on the build that you play. 99% of the players, though, will opt to play a bow unless you are playing a dot build. Then you have to play the crossbow because critical strike damage, again, is a useless stat. When you have the crossbow, the best in slot for the damage over time is going to give you a big, massive amount of vulnerable damage. Again, if we were to say, let's say masterwork this whole thing over here, not that it really matters here for the implicit, but that's 100% damage that you would be missing out on if you were to say, let's say, get the crit. However, this is where there is an exception. A lot of people really hate how the crossbow feels. And the reason why is Caltrops actually activates via your crossbow for its attack speed because it's considered a certain skill that uses that weapon archetype. It swaps to your two-handed here. So a lot of times you'll be going super fast and then you have a negative attacks per second on the crossbow. That is why you'll see some dot builds still play the bow because they hate that animation activating. It's just much slower. But there was also an update to Caltrops where it no longer needs to like make you jump back, and it was like a really slow cast animation that has been updated. But for the most part, again, if you're a dot build crossbow, and if you're a pretty much 99% of the rest of the builds that can do crit, it's just going to be your regular bow. All right, for the Druid. Now, this season, everyone is playing this item called the Rotting Lightbringer, which is a two-handed mace. But if you are playing, let's say, the Pulverized Druid, then getting specifically the two-handed mace for the overpower is good. But if you are playing a dot build, you can run the axe, but there's really not a super bad choice for the Druid. If you are doing, like, again, a dot build, you can also run the staff. There's the pole arm that can be activated. But again, it comes down to if you want to run a offhand, the one thing that the offhand can generate is lucky hit chance. And there's another mod that a lot of people really like, which is cooldown reduction as well as crit. You can get this on the Necromancer and the Sorc as well, where you can on the offhand, run, again, cooldown reduction, and this is really big for certain breakpoints. Right now, for the Sorceress, you need to get cooldown reduction. If you want the infinite teleports, you need to run a one-hander and a offhand versus a two-hander. But next up, we're going over to the Necromancer. So as far as Necromancer goes, if you are playing a summoning build, well, obviously the Scythe is going to be the one that you want to play. There is actually two Scythe. There is actually a two-handed, and a lot of people may want to run the two-handed Scythe in order to, here we go, the two-handed Scythe over here, because it just gives you double the summoning damage, and if you are putting an aspect on the two-hander, it gets multiplied times 2, obviously. So people run it for specifically that, and there is also a dot variant build, but again, it depends on what you are playing. So if you're playing dot, obviously you can run dot summoning damage if you're playing a summoner, and then most of the time though, as far as it goes, you can also get away with a sword. It's very viable on the Necromancer as well. Like right now, people are playing like the Hand of Naz, and also Sorc. So a lot of people are playing the Hydra Sorc. This is where, again, it comes down to your own personal preference. So if you want the infinite teleport, the only way to really get it is to get cooldown reduction over here, and this is a big extra bonus that you will be getting if you do happen to run the one over here. You can even maybe masterwork, get that cooldown reduction really high. I know that for Sorc in general, cooldown reduction is a very, very key stat. So you'll see this very common where they will play this. As far as like what should they play, the wand is actually a pretty good one because it's vulnerable damage, but a sword is totally fine. There's not one that's super important here. If maybe you're playing ball lightning, if they ever buff that again, the bone blade or just the dagger in general is going to be an okay one as well. Now, unfortunately, staff kind of sucks because it's dot. Now, if you're playing Hydra, you can actually do crit or dot, but the thing that is kind of nice with the two-handed is that right now, even if you're not playing the dot, you'll see a lot of people get this. And if you're wondering why, to explain it, is because with that specific Hydra two-hander, or any two-hander like that you are running, you get double the aspect, right? And it makes it much easier if you're trying to get like your weapon attacks to cast twice, or your things to do double damage, or in this case it would be Hydra heads, and you try to temper the additional heads on, instead of requiring you to do the temper of getting the extra heads here, and then once you get into the masterworking, this is where the big painful part happens, right? Where you're trying to get that triple masterwork. If you run a two-hander, which in the Sorc's case is going to be the staff, it just makes it so you only have to technically hit it like, you know, 3 times instead of getting it 3 times on here. And then also, if you really want to min-max, again, a lot of people are playing this for specifically the cooldown reduction, you would have to get the Hydra head to roll 3 times over here and get the triple masterworking, and then you also have to run another weapon, which can again be the wand, or if you want to play the sword, that is totally fine as well. Just overpowers, basically useless on the sword for the most part, unless you're doing some sort of cheese with lightning spear, which again, this is like for like 1%ing of the 1%ing, but it's a really cheesy way to try to push the leaderboard, but it does work. But also getting like say crit or vulnerable, these are like totally fine. So then you would have to then get the Hydra again. So this is the benefits of running a two-handed, is that you would only need to hit that thing once, right? Again, when you are masterworking, and also when you're tempering on, you want that maximum roll. So again, it makes it a little bit more forgiving because you only need to technically hit it 1 time. Well, it's technically 3 times in a two-hander, like 1 time, if that makes any sense. That's why some people run it that way versus getting like the offhand, getting cooldown reduction, and then again getting the triple masterwork. And that is the pain point with again running a one-hander and an offhand. And then on top of that, if the aspect is really, really good, and in Hydra's case, it is really good to have that big giant mana that you spend to get that massive bonus. But there it is, guys. All of the classes in the game, what are the best items to actually get, and again, the best rolls on average are going to be main stat, vulnerable damage, as well as maximum life. Those are, again, if you get triple GAs, that is the big money. But you also have to make sure it's not going to be, let's say, an axe, because axe has a lot less value in general if you're trying to trade it or sell the item online. But anyways, that's going to wrap it up. Hopefully this video was informative and you guys learned something new. If you did, drop a like on it. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn the bell if you want to see more content and info videos in the future. And I'll catch you gamers on the next video. Peace out.
Wow, handsome man. Just subscribe to Slaydra.